So yeah, we have two things to mention. One of them was consent for the recording. So first is that we've issued a call for papers for our panel at Mansept in September, and the panel is basically on anything having to do with the political theory of the corporation. The abstract submission deadline is May 7th. You can find the CFP on our website. The second thing to mention is that our next event will be a workshop on the 15th of April. We'll be workshopping a paper of mine on what freedom in the sphere of economic production actually is, and whether or not the corporation, especially the multinational, realizes or actualizes or embodies it. If you'd like to participate, you can email us or me, and I'll send you a draft of the paper. That's also on the website. And so that's okay. On to our speakers. Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty MacArthur Professor at Harvard Business School. Her present research focus is on the role of the private sector institutions, especially businesses, in developing an environmentally and socially sustainable economy. And that's the focus of her most recent book, very widely praised book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, came out with Public Affairs Press last year. And she's also served on various corporate boards and was an expert witness for the DOJ in their antitrust case against Microsoft in the late 90s. So represents a really broad range of experience. And our other speaker is Nicholas Versailles, who's a political philosopher at Erasmus University in Rotterdam. He directs the research project Inequality Against Freedom there, which studies the relationship between economic inequality, individual freedom, and the labor market. And he's published widely on those topics and related topics, and is the author of an excellent book, which I recommend to everybody, called Back to Socialist Basics, which is about the unity of G.A. Cohen's political thought. That came out in 2015 with Bloomsbury, and he's currently at work on a monograph on exploitation. So Nicholas will present first, followed by Rebecca, and then we'll open the floor for discussion as usual. Nicholas, you can begin now.
Can I share my screen?
You should be able to. There's a share screen button at the bottom.
No, it says this host disabled, so. Can you enable it?
Whoever is the host should do that. Okay.
Yeah, should work now.
Okay, thanks.
If you want to test again.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation. Thank you all for joining. So I shared the paper that I've recently written on the topic of the relationship between capitalism, exploitation, socialism, and freedom, the whole nexus of concepts that I've been thinking about and working on for almost a decade now. And so I shared the paper. I assume most of you have read it, so I won't go through the basics of the paper. What I want to do is run you through some of the main claims, and then say a little bit about how I think, well, some of these ideas might apply to corporations and the nature of corporate power. Now, the paper itself is a reaction to a long argument published in 2017 by John Romer in Philosophy and Public Affairs, which is a kind of retrospective, Romer's retrospective of 50 years of political philosophy. So it's Romer's take on everything. In political philosophy, it deals with Marx, Cohen, Sen, Romer, all the classics in 20th century political philosophy, and I think it's a great paper, not just because it's not written by a philosopher, it's written by an economist who has an outsider's and therefore fresher look on political philosophy, but also because it deals at depth and extensively with difficult and interesting aspects of the philosophical tradition that most of us work in. And so what I try to do in this response to Romer is not take issue with all of the stuff he talks about, but rather zoom in on certain specifics about especially the relationship between exploitation, freedom, and capitalism. And these are the kinds of things I'm going to try to run you through briefly today. So the paper itself, both Romer's and mine, deal extensively with a certain interpretation of what Marx is talking about and what the socialist tradition should be about. And as most of you will know, Romer is one of the most influential advocates of the view that the crux of the critique against capitalist institutions is distributive injustice. So capitalist institutions and the basis for criticizing them has something to do with the private ownership over the means of production and human entitlements to them. What I try to do in the paper is show that, in fact, Romer and the whole tradition behind him, so the analytical Marxists, Cohen, but also non-Marxists like Arneson, and perhaps more recently Piketty, get things the wrong way around. Distributive injustice is not the fundamental complaint against capitalism. The fundamental complaint against capitalism is that it gives people, the capital relation gives people monetary title to unilateral control over alien labor, over the labor of others. And that's the fundamental complaint against capitalist institutions and the capitalist relation as such. So I'll try to run you through the argument for that position presently. The paper goes through a model, a simple model of economic reproduction that Romer discusses in his 2017 paper, which is a very basic a single commodity model with a very rudimentary division of labor. But I'm not going to run you through the model. You know, you can read the papers and see how far you get thinking about that. That's not really important. The modeling isn't really important here. What is important is that Romer thinks he can show that a private ownership economy contrasts with a collective ownership economy in that in the collective ownership economy, there's going to be a Pareto efficient and egalitarian equilibrium in which all producers earn an equal amount, consume an equal amount of resources, in this case corn, and where they all work an equal amount of hours. This economy contrasts with a capitalist economy in which the 1% owns the means of production, and where there's a labor market. And Romer thinks he can show that in that economy, the 1% is going to appropriate surplus labor from the work of proletariat, of the proletarians, of workers who own nothing but their ability to produce, and are therefore going to exploit them, such that the total amount of time produced in this economy, the total amount of hours worked in this economy is going to be significantly greater than the collective ownership economy, just because the vast majority of humans must work for and therefore feed the 1%, the capitalists. And so Romer here takes issue with an interpretation of Marx and the Marxian tradition, which bases its interpretation of exploitation and therefore the fundamental capitalist injustice on the idea of unilateral extraction of surplus flow. So Romer comments, Marx calls these extra 170 days of labor expended by peasants surplus labor, and its existence comprises exploitation. In other words, with private and unequal ownership of the capital stock, the peasants in this rudimentary corn-producing economy, peasants must work 50% longer for the same consumption they receive with ownership of capital. So far, no normative assumptions have been made, and the claims of this paragraph and the claims that Romer attributes to Marx and the whole socialist tradition that takes its cue from Marx hasn't made any normative claims. But then Romer adds, and here's the critical sting of his position, that it must be admitted, contra Marx, that there are many instances of capitulation through hard work or inventiveness. And it is not obvious, at least from Marx's arguments, why the hiring of workers to labor on this honestly accumulated capital and their consequent exploitation, the extraction of surplus labor, should be considered an instance of injustice. We have no argument from Marx that the existence of exploitation and profits is as such condemnable, and it is noteworthy that Marx was sensitive to this problem, for he spent many pages of Capital arguing that the accumulation of capital came through robbery of one form or another, rather honest hard work or ingenuity. So in the paper, I break down this argument into 3 bits, 3 claims, 3 revisionist claims, if you like, namely that exploitation is objectionable if and only if it issues from distributive injustice. This is the canonical formulation of the Romerian position. It is robbery of one form or another. That if capitalism is to count as exploitative in any objectionable sense, then it must come about through such injustice. And that Marx affirms 2, which is explained by his being sensitive to 1. I'm not going to talk about the 3rd claim here. It's irrelevant to our purposes today. But I do want to take issue briefly with claim 1, and I'll say something briefly also about 2. Now, Romer affirms claim 1 because he affirms, like egalitarianism, he affirms the view that it's bad because unfair if one is worse off than another through no fault or choice of her own. And he affirms 2 because he affirms a version of Nozick's principle, which is the idea that if a distribution, where by distribution, I mean here what Nozick means, and Romer also means what Nozick means by distribution, namely any state of affairs that has the logical, that can be described in the logical form to everyone according to X, where X could be needs, desserts, choices, whatever have you. Now, what's interesting and relevant here is that Romer thinks that economies like economy 2, the capitalist ownership economy, can arise from just initial conditions, such as economy 1, the collective ownership economy, through just steps. So steps conforming to like egalitarian principles. And therefore, if like egalitarianism holds and if Nozick's principle holds, you get clean capitalist accumulation. And this is relevant and important because the very possibility of clean capitalist accumulation seems to entail that capitalism as such is not objectionable. What makes capitalism objectionable is colonialism, violence, plunder, robbery. But all of these claims seem to leave capitalism, cleanly generated capitalism through luck and effort, off the hook. And I want to resist that conclusion. And a lot of this paper is about resisting that conclusion. And so, in light of this aim of mine, I offer a number of negative arguments against Romer's position. I'm not going to rehearse them extensively. I try to refute the idea that distributive justice is necessary for unjust exploitation by appeal to the Pitt case. I try to refute the idea that distributive injustice is sufficient for unjust exploitation by appeal to the rich and poor case. You can read the paper if you want to talk about, if you want to look into these things, or we can talk about them in the Q&A. So I won't go through them. And also, in response to the Nozick principle, the idea that starting from a just distribution through just steps, going from a distribution D1, which is itself just, a distribution D2 through just steps, makes D2 itself just, I also think that that's false, and I provide a counter example for it. But again, we can leave this and talk about it in the Q&A. But what I want to focus here is the positive argument and the positive, if you like, vision of what my response is doing here. So again, the point of the exercise is to say that distributive injustice is at best a derivative and secondary concern of the critique of capitalist institutions and of socialism. The central concern is who serves whom and why. And in order to figure out what that means in the case of capital, we have to rethink the idea of unitary control, unilateral control over the labor of others, and how that plays out in the context of capitalist institutions. So I think that a central concern of socialism is unequal control over the labor of others, the underlying idea being that under mandatory social cooperation, there's a presumption in favor of your being able to bind others to as much and as good labor as they can bind you. And I defend this idea by appeal to an alternative ground for a generic exploitation complaint, which is the non-servitude proviso, which says that for any able-bodied and able-minded agents or groups engaged in mandatory mutually affecting cooperation and barring any special justification that exempts them, none should possess unilateral control over the labor of any other. So the proviso purports to establish a prima facie claim against unilateral control over the labor of others. And I think that's the idea that I defend in the paper, and that's the idea that I defend in the book that I'm writing, namely that capital just is a monetary claim to unilateral control over alien labor. It is a monetary title to get other people to work for you without you doing the same for them. It's a unilateral claim to servitude, the servitude of others. And I think if the non-servitude proviso goes through, then we have an explanation for what's distinctively wrong in the capital relation, why it is itself as such clean or unclean, justly or unjustly generated. Doesn't matter. The capital relation as such is problematic for that reason, such that even if the transition from economy 1 to economy 2, for example, is just, economy 2 is still unjust. And I think this claim can be made and defended. Again, this is what I try to do in the book, and helps us see and make an argument for rethinking the fundamentals of capitalism, the capitalist transactions between consenting adults, and how they relate to more structural questions such as the capitalist state, etc. Now, that's the crux of the argument I circulated. Now, I just want to say a couple of things about how that relates to capitalist production, and more specifically the corporate form, which is the focus of the project that you're all interested in. And I think there's a long tradition in socialist among socialist economists and philosophers. I think from Karl Marx to Rudolf Hilberding to Gregory Dow, of thinking about the corporate form as sort of, let's say, neutral in the socialism capitalism debate. So supposing labor managed firms are a necessary but insufficient part of any general democratic self-emancipation of humanity, there is no reason to think that those labor managed firms will not assume something like the corporate form. So I think Dow puts it very succinctly when he says that labor managed firms today are in a similar position to that of corporations before general incorporation statutes. And I think this neutrality idea makes sense to me. Just to mention briefly, in case it's relevant, that Marx himself actually lived at the time when these general incorporation statutes were either inexistent or just coming into existence. And I think it is no coincidence that he thought of joint stock companies and workers' cooperatives as respectively, he calls them the negative and the positive working out of the separation between ownership and control. In light of that separation, those of you who have read Capital Volume 3 will recall that Marx thinks that capital as ownership, not as function, capital as ownership will soon become just as obsolete as the feudal landlord looking upon his land from his obsolete porch. So I think that both Dow's and Marx's positions support this neutrality thesis, the idea that the corporate form as such speaks very little to the crucial issue of capitalist control over the labor of others, or in the more generic terms that I have expanded as monetary claim to unilateral control over the purposiveness of others, the productive purposiveness of others in this case, namely their labor. So what hampers emancipation is not the corporate form as such, but the way incorporation has been interpreted and the way we've been inured to it through centuries of capitalist civilization. So I just want to conclude by offering some further thoughts about in support of the neutrality thesis. So consider German co-determination. Germany has it built into its constitution that corporations of a certain size must involve their workers in decision making. And of course, we know the origins of co-determination. Well, those of you who aren't familiar with the history of the German Revolution of 1819, we can talk about in the Q&A, but very roughly, the whole co-determination idea was part of a ploy by Ebert and Scheidemann to quell the revolutionary fervor from below and convert worker demands for socialism into a kind of emaciated corporatism. That corporatism ended up renewing the wedlock between the German capitalists and the whole Juncker militarism. We all know how that ended up for the Weimar Republic. But we can talk about that later. The point here is that if you can build co-determination into a constitution, you can also build universal control, universal worker control for the same corporations or a mixture of state ownership or supervision and worker control. And it is relevant that this was on the table in 1919 Germany. In fact, something like this was proposed by Hilferding as part of the Independent Social Democratic Party's 1919 election manifesto. And again, I take this to support the neutrality thesis, the neutrality of the corporate form as such. I think the subjugation of alien labor, to return to the generic normative complaint here, the subjugation of alien labor and unilateral control of it is at the heart of the complaint against capital. But then if that's the case, then it's not obvious that the corporate form as such makes any difference one way or another normatively. What does make a difference is how certain interpretations of incorporation and these general incorporation statutes come to be incorporated into corporate law. And so what I'm really be interested in knowing is, and learning from you, is how these pro-capitalist general incorporation statutes came to be part of the jurisprudence of the corporation in Western democracies, and what attempts have been made, if any, to reverse them and these trends. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. A fascinating presentation. I'm looking forward to some of the responses in the Q&A. And Rebecca, the floor is yours. You're muted, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, thank you. I really enjoyed the paper and it was very interesting to see you present it. It gave me more context. Let me begin by saying that I am very sympathetic to the idea of increasing the degree of employee control within firms. But that I do not view it as the only part, or indeed the central part of the way in which we need to rethink capitalism. And that in practice, the implementation of worker control is fraught with all kinds of issues that we need to think through. I view the central problem with capitalism, and I think here I'm much closer to Roma than I am to Nicholas, is with the rules that control distribution and performance. So I think the centralization of capital is a huge problem. I think the centralization of corporate power, not only over their employees, but over the world around them, over their supply chains, over politicians, over customers, is a huge problem. And the single-minded pursuit of profit at any cost without any rules. We still have no comprehensive global carbon regulation. We have no comprehensive global labor regulation, no minimum wage, is the central issue. So while I think the non-servitude proviso is interesting and important, I would locate it as one value among many. And it's not clear to me that forcing every firm to be worker controlled would address the proviso or would address these other major issues that I'm also concerned about. So normatively, I guess I would say I'm a hopeless pluralist. I'm an economist and an empiricist rather than a philosopher. So I think of where we're trying to get to as something about non-domination, which would line up with the non-servitude proviso. So non-domination, equity, free determination, and also, so I'll leave it there, but we could talk about the natural world and so on as well. So if what we're trying to solve is a basket of problems, not only agency in the workplace, but also inequality, environmental degradation, and equity, my first pass solution would be a strong, democratically accountable, transparent, capable government. If you ask me where am I going first, that's where I'm going. I have many friends who are like perhaps many of you in the room who are fascinated by corporate governance and believe that that's an important part of the solution and that worker control is an important part of the solution. And I totally think it's an important part of the solution. But I think the primary problem is we have, except in a very few nations, we do not have governments that can control corporate capital. And that seems to me absolutely fundamental. And indeed, it seems a necessary precursor to the kinds of solutions that I think Nicholas has in mind, because the only way we can implement worker control is with this kind of democratically accountable, transparent government. So I spend most of my energy and time thinking about how the business sector could support the development and strengthening of our institutions. That said, let me sort of grapple with this question of how far changes in corporate governance could get us, and whether, assuming we have this political surrounding, whether now I'm sitting in the room and I'm saying, okay, Nicholas, let's go, let's get worker control. So here a number of issues come up for me. Most, just let's start basically. What does it mean to have control? Does it count if I have equity in the corporation? So I work for Google. I have 0.002% of the equity. All the equity is owned by the employees, but we all have 0.002. And we vote for our management team. Does that fix our problem? Does that give us non-domination? The data on this, as I read it, is mixed. Sometimes it does if it's accompanied by strong democratic processes inside the firm. The best example that I know of this, of course, is Mondragon, which has been working at this for many years. But even in Mondragon, there's strong worker management tension. I mean, I remember asking some of the people at Mondragon, you know, like, so are you implementing what I would call high performance work practices? Is everyone treated with dignity and respect? Are you focused on continuous learning? Are you growing the whole person? And they're looking at me like, sometimes, you know, so ownership doesn't necessarily confer the kind of, and Nicholas, perhaps I'm interpolating, but I'm interpolating you care about the flourishing of the whole person. So that when I go to work, I am respected, I have control over my workplace, not only in some kind of I own the stock, but on a day-to-day basis. And I would argue that normatively, that might be as important as whether I own the stock or not. So that's one issue to think about. Another is self-determination. Suppose that firms that are run as a rigid hierarchy where everyone's work is, no, this is what you have to do, you don't like it, you can leave. Suppose they are significantly more productive. I think the data on this is actually mixed, but certainly in some circumstances, it's better to have someone in charge. And things are moving very fast, and the best way to make money is like, he's really good. I'm going to work for Bill Jobs. He knows what he's doing. Hey, Bill, you have my ticket. I'm working for you. I would suggest that if we have, and remember, I've specified this very strong institutional environment, so that if I choose not to work for that kind of organization, I have many choices. I can walk across the street and work for a worker-owned organization. I can start my own firm, and there's lots of competition. So if I do go and work for a centrally owned firm, we have a decent minimum wage law, we have, you know, wages and benefits, so it's a decent job. All I've given up is that autonomy over the work. It's not clear to me we should forbid that, or that's necessarily a bad thing. I would imagine in my perfect economy that there might be some firms like this, as long as no one was forced to work for them. And as long as those firms weren't so much more productive than everybody else, that they accumulated huge amounts of capital, which could then be used to corrode the political process. So part of what I want is, you know, capital not to be able to corrode the political process, and I want some redistribution. But if you can give me that kind of institutional context, then I'm comfortable with the idea that people should be able to say, no, you know, 9 to 5 this year, I'm giving up control over my work. Another problem. I'm worried about what Roberto Unger has framed, as I remember, about the problem of the sort of, he has a great term for this, which I can't remember, but it's like, there's a group of people who get the good jobs, and there's everyone else at the edge who's working the gig economy effectively. And so we've got, you know, typically in many economies, white males in these fabulous jobs, and everybody else is off at the side. And, you know, we can't get full employment. We don't know how to make that happen. In that context, let's do the thought experiment that the good jobs, maybe it's 80% of the economy, are in worker-controlled firms. Well, that might be fantastic for the employees of those firms, But is it so good for everyone else? It's not clear to me that changing corporate governance addresses the issue of the sort of, let's call them the gig economy. I'm also concerned that worker-owned firms do not address many of the other values I care about, like climate change. Why should we believe that employees have control over their own work will be more or less likely to pay attention to the kinds of externalities they're generating? You know, I'm working for an employee-owned steel company, and the cheapest way to make money is to burn fossil fuels, and we're generating huge amounts of carbon emissions. I feel great. I'm not in servitude to anyone, but I'm still generating these enormous negative externalities. So again, and I'm sure, Nicholas, you don't mean to literally say putting in place the non-servitude proviso is the only way to fix capitalism, but I just want to really highlight that it has important limitations as we think about what's wrong with capitalism. So I think control of externalities is also absolutely critical. The place I really dig down on this reality of self-determination and come back to this idea that, you know, control a complicated idea. It's I'm enormously attracted to employee-owned cooperatives. We have a good data, I think, that employees are more innovative and creative. It's very striking that they have not, in general, been able to scale. We've seen customer-owned firms scale. You think of the big mutual insurance companies and so on. But the smaller worker-owned cooperatives have trouble scaling. Now, some of that's institutional. It's difficulty accessing cash. It's difficulty accessing action. So suppose we move through that. I still wonder if that's going to take us as far as we would like. Let me give you a sense why I worry. You know, one of the things, Nicholas, you said is the reason I'm so bothered is capitalists, and they don't do anything for me. And I thought, wait, is that quite right? So let me try an example of clean capital. I moved to the New World. I'm in New England. It's covered with trees. I moved to the New World. I turn out to be a really good woodcutter. So I cut down a bunch of trees and I build a sawmill. I accumulate the capital required to build a sawmill. All my neighbors are cutting their logs by hand in pits with these saws that go up and down. But I've built my sawmill on a river. And I want to hire people to help me work the sawmill. Well, what do I owe those people? Particularly if they can go work somewhere else and they can keep working for themselves, is it servitude to come and work for me? I'm not sure it is. I mean, I think it's best management practice to treat them with dignity and respect and engage them in the design of work and to talk to them about where we're going. But do I want to give them decision rights over, do we build another sawmill? How are the profits used? Would I be forced to do that? That feels to me uncomfortable. Now, I realize I've created a sort of very clean example in a kind of rural utopia, but I think such a thought experiment is worth holding because I don't think capital cleanly acquired when used as the basis of a productive enterprise is necessarily exploitative. Let me close by talking a little bit about the nature of the corporate form and the role it plays. So I have more than 25 years experience on Fortune 500 boards, two companies, one a very large Fortune 200 and one a small company that was 150 million when I joined the board and is now a 2 billion company, one of the fastest growing companies of the last 15 years. It makes diagnostics for vets. Great, great company. The with the corporate form is who's in charge. And you know, is that at the moment, investors are completely in charge. And for years, they said profits, profits, profits. We don't care about externalities. We don't care about social capital. We don't care about environmental capital. We don't care about political, the state of the politics. We just want the money. Now, it's clear that this push is destroying the society and the planet. And so it's problematic. And one response is to say, well, let's move the investors out. You know, let's put other people in control. And so, but then we go to the question like, well, like who? I'm worried, right? If we tell corporations, no, you have responsibility to all stakeholders, you basically put the managers in charge. If you tell the managers, you have responsibility to all the stakeholders and here's a list of metrics, whoa, who's setting those metrics? Like who is to decide how we make trade-offs as to how corporations behave? I am much more comfortable. And as I said, I'm nervous you put the workers in charge, might be good for the workers, but it still doesn't address many of the other problems we have. So I'm a big fan of, maybe this is easy to say in the US, of democratic government as a solution. The way to fix global warming is not to make firms responsible for their carbon emissions. It's to put regulations and taxes in place such you can't emit these massive amounts of greenhouse gases. The way to address worker conditions is to put in place minimum wage and a full other series of benefits, and to strengthen the labor movement and create a voice for employees and make sure everyone's represented so that there's equal bargaining power or more equal bargaining power between employees and managers. So I'm very sympathetic to the idea that in many cases, giving workers more control in their workplace may be important, might make a significant difference, but I do not see it as the central problem of capitalism or the only issue we need to address. And on that, I'll pause.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for your great presentation. So we've got two somewhat overlapping, but interestingly different perspectives on the core questions of the session. I'd like to open up the forum now to Q&A. There is on Zoom, as you guys all know, a hand-raising function. So if you use it under reactions, raise hand, then I will draft a list of questions, list of questioners in order, first come, first serve, or as soon as I notice them. And if you could please make your questions and interventions as brief and lucid as possible, then more people can ask them. So I think we will start with David is the first one.
Okay. David Seepley?
David Seepley.
Hi, Tully, thanks. Great presentations. So I have a comment for Nicholas and then question for Rebecca. So Nicholas, it sounds to me like your real issue is not with capital, but with the labor contract, right? Because in the Middle Ages, ownership of property, of land, allowed one to rule over those on the land. But in the modern era, actually owning the property doesn't give one any control over anyone. You can exclude others, and then you could also condition access upon their signing a labor contract. And the labor contract contains, a non-negotiable duty to obey as long as the command is not clearly unreasonable, unethical, or irrational. So it seems like that's the real focus of your complaint. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Like to hear your response to that. And then Rebecca, you might be a good person for me to ask this question, given your experience on large corporate boards. So in my reading of the literature, it seems that there's only one indispensable and crucial function that board serves, which is to fire incompetent or fraudulent chief executives. And that everything else could be hired out, is maybe better hired out. Compensation committees, auditing committees, et cetera. But the one crucial thing is to fire executives. And that the problems we get with Enron or all these scandals is that the boards, why are they often not doing this well? Inattention and lack of knowledge, right? And it seems that that's exactly what worker representatives would bring to the board, is attention to how the firm is being run and knowledge about how it is being run. So I'd like to get your response to that. If you think there are other things about the board that really can't be hired out, and what worker, I mean, when I was on the board legal advisory, I would just say I was desperate to get to buttonhole a worker and really find from them what the hell is really going on in this company, because I don't fully trust what the executive is telling me. So I'd like to hear your comments on that. Thanks.
You don't want, Nicholas, you don't want to respond?
I can go ahead. I'll speak after you.
Okay. So David, first, I completely agree with you as to the primary function of a board. Everything else is an attempt at working out if the senior management knows what the heck they're doing. And my experience of being on a board has been more like being in air traffic control. Everything is boring, boring, boring. What are they not telling us? What are they not telling us? What's really going on? And so you develop all kinds of mechanisms, including insisting on having dinner with people 2 levels down and wandering around and doing field visits. And so you try. As you said, it's very imperfect. The question of whether what putting workers on boards would accomplish. If I had to choose between strong worker representation within the workplace and workers on boards, I'd choose the union, because the risk of putting workers on boards is they get just as co-opted as the board members and just as snowed. Now, it's less. I mean, if that's my only choice, then I'm absolutely up for putting workers on boards. It has some potential downside in that it focuses attention on one group of stakeholders. There's some evidence that workers, again, people in the room would know this evidence better than I do, but my reading of the evidence is there's some evidence that workers on board slows down the rate of change in the company, makes it harder to really move through transformational moments, but that's hard anyway. So, so I think it would be great. I don't think it solves Nicholas's problem. I think it partially solves. I mean, you have at least the voice in the room, but the core issue is management's in charge, and how you constrain them in ways that are consistent with the public good as well as the corporate good. It's a super hard question.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, just to try to respond to David's question, I think maybe the response might attenuate some of the concerns, that were raised by Rebecca before. So my issue is not the labor contract. My issue is capital as such. And I think capital and the capital relation as such can have, of course, the labor contract is one form of that relation, one instance, if you like, of that relation. But generically, merchant type relations, I give you putting out usury type relations will count as capital insofar as they involve my having control over your labor process by giving you money or commodities. Now, I think so I don't think that the capital relation is coextensive with the labor contract, and I actually don't think it even entails wage labor or something like it. I think it's broader than that. But that's okay. I mean, that's not very interesting. What is, I think, far more interesting and might help respond to at least some of Rebecca's concerns, is that I don't think the capital relation and the kind of servitude that comes with it requires vertical relations, bosses or capitalist owners or someone running the firm. It could be, exploitation could obtain in perfectly horizontal relations between economic units. You know, a very successful business that by dint of concentration of talent, effort, and patience can do much better than another, to such an extent that the members of that economic unit come to unilaterally control the labor of other units, whether through mergers and acquisitions or even through mere trade. You know, I think you can get exploitative relations, horizontal exploitative relations, through mere exchange with other, through mere exchange between economic units. And the way out of that exploitative relation, of course, will involve state intervention and a form of state action aimed at attenuating the source of the power in these relations, notably through predistribution, education, and so on. So the ambition of the non-servitude proviso, as I presented it, is to cover both cases of vertical, but also horizontal exploitation. And it would need to cater for these kinds of cases, because it's supposed to be the normative ground for a critique of the capital relation. So yeah, I hope this helps push the discussion forward at least a little bit.
Thank you, Nicholas. It certainly does. Our next question comes from Roy Hessekers, if I pronounced that correctly.
Yes, you did, Tully. Thank you very much. And thanks, Rebecca and Nicholas, for your presentation. So I'm a Dutch corporate lawyer. I'm also not a philosopher per se. And I have a question about what the role of the commons would be in relation to your presentation. So I would think if we look at the dichotomy of capital versus labor, we really divide up the world between into an economic sphere and a political sphere, and we look on how to perform those to make them cater better for problems that we have. But I think the problems that you mentioned, for example, related to the commodification of labor or the value of the bullshit jobs that Bergman mentions, or negative externalities to the natural environment, I think those problems are not so much about the economic or political sphere, but rather about how to organize governance of the commons at the corporate level, or how to integrate the commons in corporate governance. And so if I may close with a thought on that question, I would think the question is not so much who is in charge, but how are they in charge? And I think actually looking at the COVID crisis, which I think to a large extent is a commons crisis, the way we govern that is really through science-based governance. So we're relying much more heavily on experts and technocratic processes than rather than maybe democratic processes, and also maybe relying more on conscience, on the appeal to individual virtues of everyone involved, really, not just leaders, but also citizens and anyone, any corporation involved that can help. So I think those two angles, let's say technocracy and conscientious processes at the corporate governance level, might actually be an answer to achieve that integration of the commons in corporate governance. But that's just a thought. I would leave the question happily to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Roy. Was that specifically to Rebecca, or?
Yes,
Either.
I guess it could also apply to Nicholas' presentation, but yeah.
Sure. So, Roy, I teach a course at the Harvard Business School called Reimagining Capitalism, Business and the Big Problems, which is fundamentally a course about whether and how business can address public goods problems. And I think there are examples where firms can address public goods problems. And I think I like your dual instruments, the kind of social control or social norms and technocracy, because I think in principle both are wieldable by firms. I talk about high purpose firms having an authentic commitment to the public good, and then they combine that with technology. And I suggest that, you know, some public goods problems there are actually commercially viable solutions, and so firms can make money going after them. But I think for our purposes of our conversation here, I suggest that there's a collective action possibility, for example, within regions where firms can come together to address problems in education and health, in industry, where, for example, the world's largest food companies are becoming very concerned about deforestation and are trying to address the problem of deforestation. And in mining and minerals, where we have a human rights problem. So we do have examples of firms attempting to address public goods problems in this way. And you know, the book I just published has 8 chapters and 6 of them are about this. But then where I go is nice try, but clearly not sufficient. You know, and I try and make the argument that pushing the corporate sector to behave in this way generates all kinds of positive spillovers, but there's no sense, I believe, in which it can be sufficient to address our public goods problems. I think if one thinks of them as potentially catalytic, as ways to begin to break some of the political logjams around finding political solutions to these public goods problems, that is useful. But that in the end, the public goods problems we face are so enormous in the case of global warming, for example, or so hard to solve through corporate means in the case of inequality and inequity and racial exclusion, that the firms are just not going to do it. Even though I argue that collectively, you know, if the whole of Nicholas, this is really going to freak you out. If all the firms in the world were owned by 10 people, that they would have an interest in fixing these major goods problems. And in fact, I argue that to a first approximation, the world's financial capital is sort of controlled by around 10 people, and they should be paying attention to these issues. But then I say, like, whoa, like, who made them God? That makes me super uncomfortable. And, you know, we need democratic control. So I come back to a traditional political solution, which is not to say that pushing corporations and changing corporate governance to make this kind of action more feasible is unimportant. I think it's really important. It's just not sufficient.
Thank you so much. Nicholas, do you want to take that up, or shall we go on to the next? Okay. So the next question comes from Case Coles. I think I've pronounced that right.
Thank you. I'm an economist from Tilburg University in the Netherlands. During your speech, Nicholas, I was wondering all the time, how do you define control? If employees should not be good or should not be controlled. And then Rebecca, indeed, that's also, I mean, I believe your first question, because it's all about, I think that's crucial. But my question is to you, Rebecca. You say democratic government. That's my most important solution for the problems that we face in the corporate world, especially the big multinational corporations. And it's much related to the previous question, but if to put it maybe most bluntly, if I listen to you, it looks a little bit as if you're saying that you agree with Friedman's statement from 1970. But so my question is about the social responsibility of companies. And Friedman said the only social responsibility for companies is to increase its profits. And I believe that in the end, fundamentally, that's exactly what you're saying also. You say, yeah, there are many companies who are trying to do good things, but then indeed you said it's a nice try. Okay, it's a nice try. But then you have all these other companies, and in the end, yeah, you cannot even expect companies to be socially responsible because, yeah, why would they? Why should they? Because the more externalities a company creates, the higher the profit and the higher the shareholder returns. So there's this there is this perverse mechanism which stimulates companies to increase its externalities. So to what extent do you disagree with Friedman?
Thank you for this question, Kees. It's absolutely fundamental to my work. I really disagree with Friedman, fundamentally. So Friedman says the only social responsibility for the firm is to increase its profits.
Yeah.
And the way I put this in my work is I say that statement came with a huge asterisk. And the asterisk was, because this will increase prosperity and freedom, if markets are genuinely free and fair, all externalities are properly priced, and everyone has access to capital and employment. And if in this magical, perfect neoclassical textbook world that holds, then indeed, you can make a case that the only responsibility of firms is to maximize profits. But we are not living in that world. So I believe very strongly from a normative perspective that the duty of the firm is to help build a prosperous, thriving, and just society. And that sometimes maximizing profits is a means to that end, but that when the institutional structure in which the market is embedded is fundamentally flawed, managers have a central moral duty to address the flaws and attempt to fix the institutions. So that's my going in position. Now, to your larger point, imagine me saying this in front of groups of senior executives, which I do all the time. I think it's a necessary statement. That is, I need to try and persuade them that thinking beyond profits is absolutely normatively required. And at this stage in the presentation, I usually talk about their children. Why is it you're in this room? Because your kids are telling you climate change is a problem, or because you saw George Floyd's murder and you realize, something is really wrong. So I try and create a very strong moral foundation. And then I say, okay, but you're competing in a market. What is it you can do? And the important stance is to move from maximizing profits as a goal in itself to giving a decent return to investors as a means to an end. And now let's talk about what your ends are and how you define your ends. And then let's talk about whether you can go after those ends profitably. And so I switch into an economic or pragmatic argument, which is that you can absolutely survive as a purpose-driven firm that is focused on these larger problems, that adopting this normative stance that I'm suggesting is an enormous source of creativity and innovation and authenticity inside the organization when it's done right. And that if there were many firms acting in this way, particularly if they act collectively, that you could make a real difference against the big problem. And I would characterize the discussion and, because of the publication of the book, I've had the amazing opportunity to talk to a very wide variety of managers and people thinking about these issues, is at the moment we're in the middle of a social movement that's trying to break this box. And I suspect everyone on this call is part of it, which is no, it's not about maximizing profits. It's about equity and justice and freedom and prosperity. And how do we make the firm part of that system? So I fundamentally disagree with Milton Friedman as it's currently quoted. With the enormous asterisks, we can argue about whether the math goes through. But as it's currently practiced, I think it's an extraordinarily dangerous statement. And I view, I'm part of a project called The Crisis in the Theory of the Firm with Luigi Zingales at Chicago and Karthik Ramana at Oxford and Anisat Matt at Stanford. And the project is about, let's see, your only duty is to maximize profits. Check. One of the fastest ways to maximize profits is to subvert the political system. Check. Therefore, you should subvert the political system. That's your social responsibility. Let's totally corrupt the political process so that we have, monopolists and no control and no charge for externalities. And is that really what Milton Friedman meant? And that's the crisis in the theory of the firm, is it's clear that can't be really what you mean. And so, Luigi is really taking the charge on this, is, come on, economists, this can't be the theory of the firm. We have to have a theory of the state in the theory of the firm. And neoclassical economics, to a first approximations theory of the state, is wildly unsatisfactory and needs to be reformed.
Yeah, but you're an economist, eh? So the world, people are not perfect. That's why we as economists have a living. And companies are not perfect, but also government is not perfect. And even if it would be a government, like you said, which would be transparent and a high level of integrity, it's still a democratic government. So it means it's sloppy, it's fuzzy, it's imperfect, etc. So also the imperfectness of a government should be taken into account. That would be one comment. And the other one is, yes, you can make a moral appeal to businesses. I've been a partner at my full-time job has always been being a partner at the Boston Consulting Group and Booz Allen Hamilton. So I've worked with boards for 20 years of Shell, Unilever, Philips, etc., etc. So I know that world inside out, and not just from a board perspective, external perspective. And they only move when there is a need either from government or from the public. But their economic incentives, like externalities which increase your profits and then your share price, etc., and plus competition, that gives them a very, very little leeway to do anything else than only when they are forced to do it.
Tali, can I respond? Can I just?
Yeah, sure. And then we'll give Nick a chance to jump in as well on this. Yes.
Yes, I'm so with you. I'm sitting on boards too. I ran Paul Polman's strategic retreats for 5 years. I mean, I know what it's like inside. Here's the issue. No one would say in public that it's okay to employ child labor.
Right, exactly.
Right? What we need to do, and it goes back to the point that Roy made, which is we need to change the sense of what is socially accepted. And, particularly in the US, the idea that it's absolutely okay to flood the political system with money, to deny climate change, to own the Republican Party, should be absolutely unacceptable. So I see the value of this project, if it has any, is in trying to use that little bit of wiggle room to try and shift what is morally accepted, and to try and partner with the enormous force that's beginning to emerge from employees in particular to move in this direction. So that's kind of the agenda of the work I'm pursuing. It's not firms will magically transform into good things and save the world. No.
So that's not a role for government, what you're saying now, but that's a role for all of us.
Absolutely. And I mean, to answer your question about governments are imperfect, of course they are, but I would go back to the very old-fashioned conception of countervailing power. Strong civil society, strong government, strong corporate, holding each other in balance. I don't think we've come up with anything better. Tali, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's all right. That's what we're here for. Nicholas, did you want to intervene on any of these questions of moral suasion and or the definition of control?
Well, no, I was just wondering whether so Rebecca, you said at some point that from the goal of profit maximization, you can directly derive the kind of control the capitalists have over politics and so on. But it strikes me that even if you eschew the mere goal of profit maximization, and you just say, well, you guys have a corporate social responsibility. You should, you should aim for justice and decency for all. Aren't you basically short-circuiting even that little safety we have that they will not completely take over the political process? At least if they only try to maximize profit, then we know what they're doing. But if we tell them, whoa, you guys also have a corporate social responsibility, then they will completely take over everything, and then we're really screwed because we're full on their slaves. At the moment, we're hostages to profit maximization. If we tell them you have these responsibilities, we've effectively made them rulers directly.
That's why I'm not a fan of so-called stakeholder governance. I completely agree with you. I don't think we should tell them you have a corporate social responsibility. What I'm telling them is you are destroying the planet and this is bad for business. You should address climate change because it's your best route to long-term growth. You should address the problem of rampant inequality because people are arriving with pitchforks. So I'm framing it very much around self-interest. But to your point, I don't want corporations to run the world. That's why I think it's so important to strengthen government. And Nicholas, that's why I'm not sure, but they might not be.
Thank you,
this
Rebecca.
dimension. Yeah, on this dimension. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm presently investing in pitchfork firms myself. The next person on the list is Philip.
Yeah, thanks. Fascinating talks, both of you. Thank you. I wanted to push you, both of you, on one point that's already been mentioned briefly, I think. So on how to employ change, and specifically, Rebecca, regarding your focus on legislation and the top level of government and corporate officials, and whether on the other end of the spectrum you see any, or what do you see as the role of employees and workers in these processes? Because you've talked very little about those so far, I felt. And yeah, so which also strikes me not as necessarily undemocratic, but potentially, because it's about what you've been talking about is change in very small groups that have a lot of decision-making power. So my question would be whether, yeah, what exactly is the role that the broad mass of workers and employees plays or can play in this process of change? And then to Nicholas, yeah, what exactly is your idea of how we could employ this change? You've briefly said something on this, I think, in a previous answer, but maybe you could elaborate specifically, because the Marxist idea of increasing dichotomies between classes and the necessary revolution, that hasn't come about. So yeah, what's the alternative, or what do you see as possible developments that lead maybe to change? Thanks.
Nicholas, if you want to take that first, maybe.
Oh yeah, well, very briefly, I think first of all, two things in response to Philip. So first of all, Tully's investment in pitchforks might pay off. So don't preclude that as as a possible solution. Although barbarism seems to be winning over socialism over the past 10, 15 years, but you never know. But so the very briefly, in terms of the institutional setup, of course, I haven't said anything about that. But again, the idea is that there's a vertical dimension to exploitative relations. The capitalist firm involves such vertical exploitation, so that's why you need worker control. But of course, that's not a sufficient condition for abolishing or even attenuating exploitation, especially horizontal forms of exploitation. For that, you need redistributive institutions. You need, I think, a very extensive form of public ownership. And other, the full panoply of socialist and social democratic institutions that attenuate the horizontal inequalities that give rise to these capitalist relations between consenting adults. And here, I think what's relevant, and it relates to what Rebecca said before about the gig economy and the white males who run everything else. There is there's an epistocratic element here. So there's a labor epistocracy at the center of this, what this epistocracy does is exploit everyone else. And again, the way to attenuate its power is, I think, through this set of pre-distributive institutions that were beginning to get dismantled in the 80s and now have a very weak and emaciated existence.
So Philip, forgive me. I was just sketching a solution, and I think what you heard is a sort of extreme form of corporatism where a few elites sort of sit down and control everything. I have in mind something much more like a balance between a private sector, a public sector, and a strong third sector. So I think strong labor representation is really important, both within firms and politically. Some mode of organizing. And in general, the more distributed power can be, the better. But I would leave that to the political scientists and the political economists. Our problem is concentration of power wherever it shows up. So the more we can balance power, the better.
Thank you so much. The next question I have is from Michael Bennett.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much for those presentations. This is a question for Rebecca. So I'm very sympathetic to your focus on state capacity and on democracy. But I was hoping you could say a bit more about what this then has to do with the corporate form. Well, not the corporate form specifically, but what this has to do with the corporate world in the end. So is it the case that the pathologies we see in the world of business are largely symptoms of our political dysfunction? Or is there more that we could do in changing the way the corporate world works that would help with those political problems? So it's about the direction of causation, I suppose. Because if it's really about state capacity and democracy, then probably the key thing we want to get corporations to do is just to stay the hell out of politics. But that's, and social life in all sorts of ways, but that's not a very sexy message to sell to the CEOs, whereas telling them how they can help save the world is much more exciting. So I'm not sure how we deal with that. And so to put that in a very kind of strong way, I suppose there's a bit of a worry that there's a choice between, on the one hand, setting your face against corporate power and thereby being ignored, or do we try and be courtiers to our corporate masters and try and flatter them into identifying their status in kind of more pro-social ways and less destructive ways?
So Michael, I've gone full out courtier. That's what the book is. Mm-hmm. The book starts with, we have massive problems. You have a normative duty to address them. You can make some money to do it. Oh dear, just doing it alone doesn't work. Well, try cooperating. Oh dear, that doesn't really work either. Oh, it's only government that can solve the problem. Whoa, big problem with government. You guys have been corrupting it for the last 50 years or ignoring it altogether. Maybe that was a mistake. Central article in the Harvard Business Review, free markets need free politics. That was in March of last year or February this year. What does the pandemic tell us? It tells us we need state capacity and you have to stop messing with it. Here are the 3 actions you should take. 1, get money out of politics. 2, push back against voter suppression. So right now in the States, there's a very strong move. Well, not very strong. We are doing all we can, us courtiers, to push the big CEOs to come out in public against the voter suppression. So if you saw Coca-Cola and Delta come out yesterday against the voter suppression laws in Georgia, that's because there's a coordinated campaign to pressure them to do that. And how I think about what I'm trying to do is to open the mental space to make that a thinkable thought as a CEO. It's consistent with my fiduciary duty. It's consistent with my moral duty. It's consistent with my economic duty. And so this project has always been a rhetorical, persuasive project. I mean, my scholarly work, Nicholas, you and I should talk, because my scholarly work is about purpose in organizations and authenticity and how it drives productivity. And so that's my scholarly work. But this work is about the world is burning. Can we get the corporate sector to move? But yeah, full out courtier. I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School. I was using my structural position.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I mean, and I hope you don't. I really didn't mean that in a snarky way at all.
Michael, it is what it is.
Yeah.
Right. It is what it is. And you have this choice of, well, at least they'll listen to me. How far can I push the conversation?
Yeah.
And I think it's super important to have the attack. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's really important to have the full-on attack. And I don't for a moment think firms can fix our problems.
Yeah, of course. And then there's an ecosystem here, right, where you need outsiders shouting and waving pitchforks so that the insiders can say, well, maybe you'd like to be a bit nicer, and otherwise they'll burn you down. So they work together. But I suppose my concern is just that with something like the voter suppression, when you mentioned that there's something of a paradox in this particular case where really you want to get CEOs out of politics, that you're then asking them to just get, the more you try and get them out, the more you just pull them back in. You know what I mean?
And that's a fundamentally difficult issue, right? But the alternative, I mean, they're already in. American politics is fundamentally corrupted by the fossil fuel industry, as a concrete example. That has to become unacceptable. And one of the ways to make that unacceptable is for other CEOs to say, look, you have to stop. Make it transparent, pull it out, have shareholder votes, anything we can do. Because I mean, to your question about causality, the two have been interacting with each other. And yeah, we could talk more, but yes, you're right. It's a huge problem.
So we have a couple more questions from Roy and David, although I would like to exercise my executive function and ask a question myself, if that's okay. And this question is for Nicholas. So Nicholas, capital itself is, correct me where I depart from your view here. Capital itself is a kind of relational structure. It's a right to extract income generated by the deployment of an asset in production. One owns that asset when one has that right to collect the income that arises from its deployment. And so that it's a relational structure in at least three senses, right? It's a relation between the rights holder or the owner of the asset and whoever is supposed to enforce that claim on the income that comes from its deployment. Maybe that's the state. And it's the relationship between also whomever would, without that enforcement, have some claim on the income derived from the asset's deployment and production, maybe a worker, for example. And so that analytically doesn't require that the asset holder, the owner, in this case of capital, is the one who decides unilaterally which productive enterprises it should be invested in, but it always goes along with it in every existing society that we've seen that has this feature. So let's just build it into the definition. And that's what makes it a form of control over the workers, insofar as the workers are required to be involved in the productive enterprise that the asset is used in that generates the income. And that's what makes capital a form of control over workers. That's what I take you to be arguing, something like that. If that's basically your view, why is the corporate form neutral if what we mean by the neutral with respect to this problem, if what we mean by the corporate form as a kind of social technology for aggregating private capital under one sort of unilateral decision procedure? That's just what it is. So it seems to me if the problem is the kind of unilateral control over capital defined that way, then all corporations, insofar as they're business corporations, right, are not neutral. I mean, they're just it's a suite of technologies that are used to kind of aggregate that, under one unilateral will. So yeah, if you could just speak more to your definition of capital and the neutrality thesis.
Well, it's just that I don't see why, in principle, the corporate, there could be single, like, a corporation consisting of a worker-owned firm, a bunch of worker-owned firms which produce, under a set of strongly egalitarian predistributive institutions, and where aggregate investment is democratically controlled somehow. If you have this set of institutions, even if the workers produce under the corporate form, I wouldn't say there's any, I mean, there's no control over labor is not unilateral. It's a accumulation, and everyone's share over social labor is omnilaterally determined. It is democratically determined, and therefore not a source of domination. At least that's the idea.
Okay, thanks. I'll mull that issue. Rucker, would you like to pose a question here?
Yes, one question and a thought. So the question is for Rebecca. You mentioned the concept of fiduciary duties a moment ago, talking about whether the things you want corporations to do are consistent with the director's fiduciary duties. I think you mean with respect to the corporation and its shareholders, as this is normally phrased in American corporate law, where it is ambiguous whether corporation and its shareholders just means shareholders, or whether these are two separate things, and if so, what kind of tension that brings. Now, I'm myself tempted by the thoughts that maybe the first fiduciary duty of corporations is, so of the directors is towards the corporation, but then the corporation's duty is towards society at large, because of the way in which corporate law sets up the corporate form and gives privileges to corporations that are not given to those who engage in business without incorporating. I'm inspired by David Sipley, who raised an earlier question about this, but also others like Lynn Stout's work, for example. And I would see the fiduciary duties, or at least that's what I'm trying to argue currently in a paper. The fiduciary duties towards shareholders, I would see them as derivative, in the sense that these are duties which should stimulate the corporation to create economic growth and development. But that's just sort of a side project, and it's like sort of part of the larger task that society sets for business corporations, so to speak. So the first fiduciary duty would be towards society at large. Now, I don't know if such a thing can be realized in law, but as a sort of moral structure, because of the relation with the creation by the state of corporate law and the corporate form. Would you be tempted by such a thought, or would you say, no, this is really an unreformable part of corporate law? The fiduciary duty should be towards shareholders, and then all the other problems or externalities, let's sort of call everything that is a problem an externality, they should be solved by moral appeal and having a strong civil society and state regulation, etc. So I think that's the real issue. I mean, it seems as if, although I completely understand you do not agree with Friedman in saying this world is not ideal, there is still a benchmark which this ideal world fulfills, which comes from the economic model, in saying, well, if the world would be ideal, corporations could just go for their profits. Well, I think a case can be made, if you look at the history of corporations, that no, they were originally devised as constructs for specific public works, infrastructure works mainly. And then later on, this was enlarged, but still there is this link in the sense that they get privileges, legally speaking, that others do not. Yeah, I'll leave the other comment. Nicholas will talk more about that some other time.
Rutger, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that corporations have a social license to operate, that their legitimacy rests on public consent. I think we have to be careful with the history. I mean, in England, one of the first public chartered corporations was the East India Company, which was chartered for the public good of, laying waste to the East Indies and extending slavery and, doing all kinds of terrible things, but it was great for the British Exchequer. So, I'm always a little bit nervous when people say, well, incorporation is all about the public good. And I was like, yeah, but on the legal questions, I'm a big follower of Justice Leo Strine, who I think has advanced a number of reforms which would move corporations, which would move the interpretation of fiduciary duty away from the current interpretation, which can be perceived as short-term profits right now, and the duty to sell the corporation for maximum cash value. And I think he advances a number of reforms which would allow directors to feel much more comfortable thinking about the long-term well-being of the corporation and allow them to take into account the well-being of stakeholders like employees as they think about the disposal of corporate assets and so on. So my reading of the law, for what it's worth, and the lawyers I've talked to say this is probably okay, is directors already have that latitude, except when they are in a Revlon or Unical situation. But at the moment, many directors are nervous about exercising it, and the court has not been clear. So I think we could clarify the law so fiduciary duty was a much broader, to the corporation and its shareholders. Whether we should completely change who you owe fiduciary duties to or what the goal of the company is, I'm nervous about the set of problems that Nicholas raised, which is if we simply say you have a duty to the public good, well, who is that and who enforces it and how do we think about it? So any change in the fundamental law, I think, has to be accompanied by really thinking about how would we measure it, who would enforce it, who would decide. But a broadening to allow a focus on the longer term and the well-being of the corporation, I think, would be well worth making.
Andreas, you have a question.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for Nicholas. I was wondering whether you have some kind of normative guidance for reform short of a revolution, because as I saw it in the presentation, the non-servative proviso doesn't really deliver that. And so are there kind of degrees of exploitation that could account for the difference between horizontal exploitation on the one hand and phenomena that you find in the gig economy, for example? Or would it be more straightforward than to take some kind of distributive perspective into account, especially as you talked about mechanisms for pre-distribution, which could be, taken step by step? Then it might be more straightforward to use distributive formula. But basically, my question is there some kind of variance in your normative guidance that could help us for reform short of, the whole socialist program?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think I take it that, well, so I think the theory of transition and transitional justice would have to be somehow systematically derived from, as you say, from some normative principles. And I think the Kantian tradition, as opposed to the Republican tradition, offers better guidance as to what that would be. And so the theory of transitional justice, I take it, would allow, for example, for at least some wage labor in the transition from capitalism or a humanized capitalism to socialism, for instance. And the way to do that systematically, I think, would involve us thinking about the notion of monetized servitude, what it is to be someone's servant through things, and under what conditions that otherwise impermissible relational feature may be allowed, if and only if it serves universal, unsubjected purposiveness. And I think there's a story that a Kantian can offer here, which is, that it might be permissible for me to serve others if and only if that service makes me capable of rational self-determination in the immediate future, and that could apply. That thought, I think, could apply globally to every subject of an economic relation. But how exactly to spell this out, the normative condition, what it means for me to serve the conditions of my freedom, I think exists in the whole Kantian, it's the Kantian idea that I can empower public officials who, through offices of responsibility, have no private power over me, have a responsibility to promote the conditions of my own purposiveness, such that when I serve them, I serve indirectly only the conditions of my own purposiveness, only the conditions of my own freedom. So there is a story, I think, that can be said about transitional justice there. Now, how these offices would be created, whether they would require reform, revolution, or both, I don't know. But that's I expect that's more of an empirical question. We can't, there's no a priori reason to arrive at a priori way to arrive at an answer to that question. But what we can do a priori from the armchair is ask what the servitude is, what are its conditions of possibility, and how we get from here to there. That is what a theory of transition would involve for getting from some form of servitude to complete emancipation. I think we can do that by theorizing a priori about these things, but that's not the reform or revolution issue. At least that's how I've been thinking about it.
Thank you for that. I think David Seepley, you have your hand.
Great. Yeah, I wanted.
Okay.
If there was time, now there's a chance to speak. I had a couple of follow-ups. So first, for Nicholas, if I understood you were asking if anyone knew about the history of general incorporation laws, and I can speak to that. It wasn't clear to me why general incorporation was central to the problem for you. Maybe you can say another word about that. For me, it's just that it changed the optics and makes them look more like, privately formed associations, fully private, whereas really they're still state chartered and get privileges from the state. But in any case, the history in brief, and then it leads to a question for you, is really, so this happened first in the US. It really begins in Massachusetts with general incorporation for churches, but then it spreads later to the business form. And there were really three issues driving this. One is that the legislatures, as you may know, it's this individual states in the US that overwhelmingly charter corporations. There were just so many applications for charters, and that the legislatures were just getting bogged down, spending all their time reviewing charter applications. So that was one practical reason. Second was political complaints about the inequality of this, that it was just the wealthy and politically connected who are getting the charters and not the ordinary farmer, working man, or whatever. And then the third issue was political corruption, because when these are individually chartered, you can imagine that a kind of payoff to the legislature to get you the charter, then or just a kind of if they give it to you, a kind of political campaign contribution later on. This became a real source of political corruption in the U.S. This is like 1830s, 40s, 50s. So general incorporation, those are all three legitimate problems, real problems, and general incorporation did a lot to solve them. So it does raise the question if you want to get rid of that. I mean, those are all going to be issues that I think you would have to deal with. Then a quick follow-up for Rebecca. Well, first of all, thank you for your arm twisting on Delta and others to get them to come out against the voter suppression laws. And you must be friends with Judy Samuelson, and I'm kind of involved in that Aspen Institute crowd also. In all these issues, there are these kind of dilemmas and trade-offs, and I wonder if you feel this one, because you talk about the concentration of power being the problem, and of course I'm very sympathetic to that. You sound like maybe an adopted American. Maybe you know the history of the progressive era, where there's a great debate among progressives about this. On the one hand, you had Teddy Roosevelt arguing for, concentrate and control. Let them concentrate, and then the government can control them. And on the other hand, you have, Woodrow Wilson arguing for, not unregulated competition, but regulated competition, right? And there are things to be said on the concentrate and control side. For a lot of progressives, the issue is unionization. It is just much more difficult to unionize a bunch of small firms than it is to unionize a few behemoths. You can also think about this in the context of environmental regulation. It's a lot easier to regulate a few big, oil companies than thousands of these wildcat, frackers out in the West. So I wonder if you feel that kind of dilemma. I mean, I myself do. I'm in favor of strengthening antitrust, but I see some of the advantages too on the regulatory side of the scale. So those are my questions.
I'll very briefly. Thanks, David, for mentioning the stuff about general incorporation. So I have to think about this. I know very little about this, so I'll look forward to reading more about it, especially your work. Now, vis-a-vis your second question, which was addressed to Rebecca, but I think it's very important. I don't see why concentration as such is a problem. It may be a boon. It depends on who controls these powers and what systematic guarantees there are. I mean, structural guarantees that they will be geared towards human freedom as opposed to barbarism. So and for that you need empowered public offices and public control over these things. And of course, Rebecca will knows a lot more about this than me, but it would seem like the empirical question is somehow overdetermined here. And what really matters, it seems to me at least, is we need to figure out what the criterion is for, over concentration or under concentration, and the whole literature on market concentration indices and so on just seems to completely have lost sight of this end, and therefore have very little interesting things to say about what the issues at stake are. At least that's an outsider's impression of what's going on there.
So David, fantastic question. I spent a year of my life trying to break up Microsoft. So I do think some companies can get too big. To Nicholas's point, it's all about control and measurement. The literature on do you have to be big to generate innovation turned out to be ambiguous. Sometimes it helped, sometimes it didn't. And sometimes they are much more efficient and effective, but sometimes they're dangerous as heck. There's really interesting emerging work in antitrust now focused on the big platform companies, Facebook, Google. I'm sure those of you who are interested in this issue are following it. But are we looking at the right kind of harm? If Facebook doesn't charge anyone, does that mean they're causing no consumer harm? Well, probably not. So how do we, redefine how we think about harm? How do we think about political control? I think it would be important to distinguish between economic power and political power. You could imagine large companies that actually didn't exercise that much economic power, but had significant political power, and that would be a problem. So yeah, super tough question, needs a lot more research.
Great, thanks.
That's what we're here for. Chi, would you like to ask?
Yeah, so thanks for the two great presentations and dialogue. So my question is more directed toward Rebecca. So most of your arguments about what reforms and temporary steps that we could take in order to make business corporations less of a problem in our society, which I agree with you on many of the points. But I'm less clear about what's the ideal picture that you're envisioning, right? So for example, what would a business corporation in an ideal world look like in terms of its corporate structure? So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on this, because I think Nicholas has a relatively clear picture on this, like the ideal corporation should be a worker managed firm, something like that.
Chi, I wish I could give you a good answer. I don't think we know. I'm guessing. Okay, my guess is the ideal world is very strong civil society with strong sense of shared norms and commitment to the whole. Strong distributed democracy with transparency and accountability at multiple levels. And a corporate sector that is heavily regulated, size, externalities, working conditions, populated by a mix of firms. There would be, in my perfect world, there would be many more worker-owned firms than there are now. I think Marija's point in the chat is super interesting, which is there reason to think that if Facebook, for example, were owned by 10,000 employees rather than by Mr. Zuckerberg, would it have a different sense of its social responsibilities and its social awareness? I think it's a super interesting question. I think I too easily dismissed. I said, well, you know, they won't have economic incentives different from Mr. Zuckerberg, so there'll still be problems, but they might very well have a different social construction. But I was talking to one friend on a podcast, and he said, Rebecca, you called your book Reimagining Capitalism, but you should have called it Back to the Capitalism of the 50s and 60s but without the racism and the misogyny, please. You know? So I'm very old-fashioned in that sense. I'm up for a mixed liberal economy, and it won't be perfect, and there'll be tons of tension, but I think there are good reasons for thinking, if I have to design something now, that's where I would go.
So maybe you can change it to retro imagining capitalism in a second. Philip, would you like to ask your question?
I have a question for Nicholas, because you mentioned Marx on the stock corporation, and I wanted to ask whether there's any room for the concept of class in your concept of exploitation and non-servitude. So maybe you could talk about who exactly in that concept is the exploiter. Whom do people serve? Is there still such a thing as class in this in this whole concept, and specifically because who belongs to it? Because if I read Marx correctly in Capital Volume 3, he says, well, the managers are actually not more working class than capitalists. And that leads to a host of problems, I think, afterwards, because, on that.
So is there class and class division still? Of course. Is there, of course there is, but are the distinctions as fine-grained or as cleared as Marx envisaged? Probably not. And Marx probably gets it wrong in Volume 3 of Capital in thinking that managers, especially upper echelon managers, are just receive wages of supervision. They don't just receive these. And in that text, he mentions the swindles that take place in the managerial boardroom to deprive the owners of capital of a share of the profit. So he entertains that idea, but then leaves it undeveloped. But to cut a long story short, exegetically only, I think there's plenty of room within the Marxist text to call out and to dub certain forms of managerial labor as capital. That is, as monetized control, monetized claim to the unilateral labor of others. But that's not really what Marx wrote. Is not really relevant unless it is, I'd say, complemented by an interesting normative theory first, and secondly, a very relevant, let's say, relevant theory of class. And we do have a class theory from Eric Wright. And what that theory does, I think, is that it not only explains, the role and structure of the capitalist worker separation, 1% versus 99% and so on. There's a lot of caveats about this mapping I just gave you, but I think it's roughly correct. But it also helps us understand how to think about the remaining 9% in the, in the 10%. So, the 1%, okay, they're capitalists, the 90% are workers. What do we do, and how do we think about the remaining 9%? And Wright has this idea of contradictory class locations, which he develops and discusses. And that's a pivotal notion, I think, because it's that class that's going to decide whether, there is, if and when there is an emancipatory attempt to change capitalism, it may be that that class decides, and its allegiances decides who wins and who loses. But these are all issues of social theory that I don't. We can talk about, but that are not central to the argument I want to develop here, which is mainly a normative argument about how to understand capital and the fundamental wrong of exploitative relations, of which capitalism is just one instance, I'd say.
Rebecca, did you want to ask a question?
I had a question
for
Nicholas, if I could. Nicholas, help me understand the boundary conditions. My example of building a sawmill in the woods, there's me, I've built a sawmill. My neighbors come and say, I'd love to work with you for a day a week because, hey, it's a much, you'll pay me well, and I know you're a decent manager and you'll listen to my suggestions and we'll all kind of do this together. So in the best possible conditions where I'm, to David's point, we have a fantastic labor contract. You could leave and do something else at any moment. It is working at the sawmill, is that inherently exploitative?
Yeah, thanks. So, yeah, I think it depends. It doesn't just depend on whether you have what your exit options are. Of course, it might matter what your exit options are, but the sawmill case, I'd say, as long as the surplus is not shared in proportion to, say, effortful contribution, is exploitative. If, in virtue of owning the land, I can get you to work for me more than I work for you, just in virtue of that, then I'm exploiting you. There might be exceptions. So, I think there's a presumptive case against this kind of transaction, and in a non-exploitative society wouldn't allow it. And I'd like to say that even if it's more efficient for you to serve me than me to serve you, maybe efficiency trumps exploitation in that kind of case, but it's still exploitative and presumptively wrong, and we should be mindful of that when we engage in that kind of transaction. And I think that kind of transaction applies not just to sawmill cases when I go there, I build the sawmill, that allows me to unilaterally extract labor from you. It applies to idea generation and other kinds of situations, which again allow me to control your labor unilaterally. And just to qualify this, I don't think that if you and I get rewarded in proportion to effortful contribution, that we're exploited, or either one of us exploits, as long as there is no unilateral control over that labor flow.
What if the company would make a loss? Because it's also about risk appetite and risk return. So yeah. if the worker is risk averse and the entrepreneur is risk loving.
Yeah. I mean, these possibilities are pervade economic relationships. And I said what I just said is that I think there would be it might be that efficiency and exploitation are that efficiency and non-exploitation are competing values, and that in some cases an efficient firm would be an exploitative firm. That's not conceptually, I don't think that's a conceptual impossibility, and it's just one more of the many trade-offs we have to figure out and think about when we're thinking about, we're trying to figure out what the just society ought to look like.
Thank you so much for that, Nicholas. I think that's a opportune and poignant position on which to end the discussion. I would really like to thank everybody, including and especially our two discussants, panelists for today, for contributing. It was really fantastic talk, and the recording, subject to approval, omnilateral approval, as it were, will be available on the website. And I encourage everybody to keep posted with our project and the events that are going to be coming up, including the workshop for my talk and my paper in 2 weeks, if you're interested, and our call for papers for Mancept. Rucker